Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting into God of Hammers, because we ain't talked about Thor in a minute. So to start this off, we're gonna do a bit of catching up as far as what's happened since Devourer King, but then also we'll talk about how God of Hammers, as well as the events leading up to it, have really been a part of this huge cycle that has been repeating and overlapping for billions of years. But not only are we shown this cycle in issue 19, but we're also shown what stage of the cycle God of Hammers is landing in. But on top of that, there's also a few prophecies that we see Thor juggling at this time that gotta be addressed as well. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so with us getting into Thor God of Hammers, this is something that's been brewing up throughout the entirety of Thor Volume 6, and technically you could say that it's been brewing longer than that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why through the course of this, but just to get caught up to the start of God of Hammers, this builds on top of what we'd seen in issue 1, with Thor recently becoming king, and with doing so him noticing that Mjolnir was getting heavier and heavier, which for a while, like we'd seen, this had led Thor to believe that he was struggling to lift Mjolnir as a result of his transition from warrior to king, which wasn't the case, but with the number of people who had been lifting Thor's hammer, who weren't Thor, skyrocketing on top of him struggling to lift it, this is what initially caused him to craft that theory. And understandably so, because the number of people lifting Mjolnir, not even just in this series, but also collectively around this time, it had made it seem like all of a sudden everybody was just worthy. But also with cases where we saw either Tony Stark or Eddie Brock summon Mjolnir, which from Thor's perspective, with him seeing this, it seemed to solidify his theory as far as him becoming unworthy, with him becoming king and not being full-time warrior. But this also stacked on top of a number of insecurities he'd been dealing with while he was trying to figure this out. Because if Thor, the king of Asgard, if he can't lift or control his hammer, for him it just seems like a sign of weakness. And so what this led to for Thor was pretty much a solution of him doing an Odin's Son reset by summoning Dr. Donald Blake, which is something Thor hadn't done in a long time. But of course, that also went left when the Midgard Serpent made its way to Dr. Blake first, to where then Donald Blake took the Midgard Serpent's power, and when Blake came back, he was just out for everybody who was touched by Odin's magic. And with how this played out, it was such a good story. We probably need to go back and just hone in on this one itself, because the 6-part series Prey, it took Donald Blake as an individual character to a whole nother level, especially with him finding out that he was just a means of teaching Thor a lesson, and that pain that he felt when he discovered the truth, it kinda made you root for him. Until he came across Throg, because when Throg stepped in, he definitely stole the show for a little while. Like, the gnashing of teeth was no joke. But after Prey was settled and the new solution for Donald Blake was figured out, this experience pushed Thor to make his next decision, with this taking him to a place where he truly felt helpless. And with how this ended with Thor making a call as the king of Asgard, which also was a call against Odin's wishes, but with Thor doing this, it made him realize that he is stepping into the role of king. And with Thor believing that his transition from warrior to king is causing him to lose his ability to lift Mjolnir, he goes to meet with Captain America at Avengers Mountain and he leaves Mjolnir there. Only then for Thor to get the call like 2 issues later that Mjolnir has been stolen, which really is the call that sets the stage for God of Hammers, because now you have like this mystery of who took Mjolnir and the hunt for finding Mjolnir and bringing it back. But from here, where God of Hammers kicks off, it starts like a run through of the history of the Marvel Universe, but of course doing this with more of the modern details included, with it mentioning the Elder Gods, the Ancient Giants, as well as the Black Winter, the God Tempest, the King in Black, and the Phoenix. But most significantly, we're being shown this because there's a cycle that repeats. In this cycle that we're being shown, it's been demonstrated for ages. And in this example, we're taken back billions of years ago, where 2 titans clashed. There's blood, there's fire, there's rage, and born from the forge of that rage, there was annihilation. Where in this case, we're shown as an example, the debris from one planet being destroyed, causing the annihilation of the dinosaurs. But again, the emphasis of this introduction, it's very much focusing on the cycle itself, more so than the details of this first example, because even billions of years later, this cycle from fire to gods to rage to annihilation, which leads to entropy, and with that chaos and uncertainty, it flows into eternity. But within these last 2 steps of the cycle, seeds are planted that will eventually blossom, and from each one of those that blossom, from them the cycle just continues. And it's here where we're shown more specifically with Mjolnir, where a piece of a moon that was made entirely of Uru metal crash landed on Nidavellir, to where from there, as we know, Odin trapped the god Tempest in this piece of Uru, which he then had the dwarves forge into Mjolnir. And this portion is taken out of Jason Aaron's Mighty Thor, issue 12, back when we were given the more in-depth story about the creation of Mjolnir, with us seeing Odin weaken the god Tempest and trap it within this piece of Uru that would be forged into the hammer. And really what's happening here at the beginning of God of Hammers is that we're being shown the cycle continuing from that seed to two other titans clashing, and born from the forge of that rage, annihilation, which would then go into entropy, and from entropy into eternity. And in this case within itself, we're shown that the fire, the gods, the rage, the annihilation, the entropy, in the final phase eternity, that this second full cycle that we're shown is the creation of Mjolnir, which also along the way includes Odin trying to control the hammer, which flew him all around Asgard, nearly destroying the place, which at the time Odin did make people swear never to tell a soul, for him then to place an enchantment on the hammer which would make it impossible for almost anyone to lift. But the story of Mjolnir within itself, it was a full cycle. Odin's enchantment was the entropy, and the Tempest being trapped in the hammer represented eternity. But then after us seeing that the creation of Mjolnir was another cycle, which like we just seen, it ended with eternity, but now we're shown here that in a world of gods and titans that not even eternity can last forever. And well after the creation of Mjolnir, we're shown where a new cycle begins again, which takes us to Jason Aaron's Mighty Thor issue 12, which once again starts this new cycle with the Clash of Titans. And at this time when Jane tied Mangog to Mjolnir and cast them into the sun, this continues the cycle much like we were shown earlier, with the dark and the light, which is how it starts with the gods, which then takes us to the next step with the blood and the fire, to where in this case the battle itself was the blood, and after when Mjolnir and Mangog got tossed into the sun, that took it to the fire, and then next when Mjolnir returned, this then took us into the current day, to where at this point in the cycle we land on rage, which is something I kind of want you to just keep in the back of your mind through the course of this event. But at this point here where we pick up with Thor, not long after he'd gotten the news from Captain America about Mjolnir being stolen, and he makes his way to Sif telling her to point him to the person who stole Mjolnir. But Sif tells Thor that she sees nothing, which throws both of them for a loop, because you would think Sif would be able to see someone breaking into Avengers Mountain and taking Mjolnir. But then it's here where Sif tells Thor that now that Beta Ray Bill is back, let him take care of this, so that Thor can go back to his throne and just be king. But then it's here where Thor tells Sif that he had read from the Great Tome of Kings, which is a book that has gone from Buri to Bor to Odin to Thor, which has been passed down from king to king, and the words in this book can only be seen by the true king of Asgard, with it being written and read only by them, with it holding secrets of the past as well as some information about the future. And it's here where Thor tells Sif that he'd been reading this thing for days without food or sleep. And as far as what Thor had read from it pertaining to what's to come, he told her that it speaks of a great storm, the likes of which we've never seen, brought forth by Mjolnir, wielded by a being known as the God of Hammers. And it goes on to say that this being will kill the Golden King of Asgard, and his soul will be trapped in the fire forevermore. And so with Thor telling this to Sif, there's two things I want to point out here, because first, in issue 8, we learned that there's more in this book that Thor hasn't discovered yet, which for Thor also leaves room for some misinterpretation. But then also in issue 16, not long after Thor had left Mjolnir at Avengers Mountain, he had a conversation with Jane Foster about his death, which he was shown by the Black Winter, to where in that instance he had went into more detail with Jane. But just to be clear, the vision that Thor had seen from the Black Winter, with him being killed by Thanos holding Mjolnir, and what he had read from the Tome of Kings, these are two different events. But with Thor being shown the death of Thor, on top of reading the fate of the Golden King of Asgard, in this moment with him only mentioning what he had read from the book, he lets Sif know that he's not going to let this book tell him how he's going to die, with Thor at this point making his own interpretation of what the Tome of Kings is telling him. But at this point, with Sif not able to see who they're looking for, Thor just tells her to tend to the things that she can see, and in the meantime send him to his old man, which from here sends us over to Odin, who at this time is in an arena that has no earthly translation as far as the name of this place, and for those who can translate, they can't agree upon a name. And aside from that, no one agrees on its origin. But also for just a bit of context here, the reason why we're finding Odin at this location is because not long after Thor had dropped off Mjolnir, him and Odin were summoned to Valheim by Freya, only to then find out that it was really his sister Angela that called them both there, and likely doing so because if she said it was her, then Thor and Odin wouldn't have showed. But at this point between issues 16 and 17, Angela lets them know that she'd brought them here because she's seen the chaos going off around Thor, from the Black Winter to the death of Galactus at Thor's hand, Donald Blake, the World Serpent, Mjolnir, and how these unfolding events are of the growing entropy of Odin's enchantments, which in other words, considering this huge cycle that we were just shown, the fulfillment of the entropy, it follows rage. And that we'll definitely talk about more through the course of this event. But with Angela calling them to Valheim and bring this to their attention, she lets Thor and Odin know that the son can learn from the father and the father can learn from the son, because the consequences of what happens to the throne, they affect everyone. But with this conversation rubbing Odin the wrong way, because he knows that he's done plenty, regardless of a lot of it being questionable. But with Angela telling Odin and Thor to clean this up, Odin more or less takes it as an insult, but then it doesn't help when Angela then tells Thor to either clean up his kingdom or she'll have to take it from him. But with this short family reunion causing things to go left, Freya told Angela to take Odin and go somewhere so that her and Thor could have a talk about what he was told about the Phoenix. But this moment here was really more of a conversation of the two of them talking about Thor dealing with these revelations more than anything else. But regardless of the fact of who Thor's actual mother is, she tells Thor she's not Gia, she's not the Phoenix, but she is the woman who raised him. And when Thor spoke his first word, it was mother, and when he said that, he was talking to her. So for Thor, though Freya's not his biological mother, the fact of Freya being the woman who raised him, that's one thing that he doesn't have to question. But at this time, this is when Angela took Odin to this arena, telling him if he wanted to fight somebody, like this was the place for him, when really Angela had just taken Odin here just to throw him in the middle of countless death matches. So at this point for Thor, with him just getting here, Odin had been here for some time. But with Thor getting here and saving Odin in the nick of time, keep in mind that prior to this, when Angela had asked the two of them to work together, Odin didn't want to help Thor, because from Odin's perspective, as a dad, with Thor being the king now, Odin wanted Thor to figure this out on his own. But with Thor showing up here and then saving his dad, Thor made it more so seem like an eye for an eye type of thing, which probably is a bad analogy, using those words specifically. But more or less Thor's like, I helped you clean up your mess, so now you can help me with something. And it's from here where Odin agrees to help Thor find Mjolnir, which really at this point is the two of them doing what Angela had asked, but of course Odin and Thor had to find their own way around to doing this. But it's from here where Odin takes Thor to Nidavellir, and Thor initially thinks that Odin is bringing him here to forge another hammer, but no, Odin's bringing Thor here, because each weapon that the dwarves cast is imbued with a portion of their souls, and because of that the dwarves can track anything that they've made anywhere across the stars. But when the two of them get here, to their surprise, they find that the forge has been wrecked. And it's not even as if this was showing signs of some type of fight, but this was just a complete slaughter. And they could tell just from the looks of it that it was a swift one at that, because the Val Ravens were killed without even moving from their perch. And with them walking inside and finding that all the dwarves are dead, as well as the forge just shattered, it doesn't take Thor and Odin long to realize that this was done by Mjolnir, which again, in relation to that cycle that we've been shown, born from the Forge of Rage comes annihilation. Alright, so picking right back up from where we left off, with Thor and Odin finding the dwarves of Nidavellir just wiped out. But with seeing this, Thor takes the time, and this says a lot about Thor right here, because he takes the time to bury each and every dwarf that he can find, and he buries each of them seemingly in the same way that he does here for Eitri, the Forge Master of Nidavellir. And it's pretty crazy because when he lowers Eitri into the ground, Thor's naming Eitri's brother, his wife, his child, and I wouldn't put it past Thor that for everybody here, every dwarf that he's buried, that he knows them all by name, and he laid them all to rest saying some kind words. Because we can even look back at certain tellings of that moment when Mjolnir was initially forged, and in some of these stories you'll see a young Thor joking around with Eitri and his brother Brock. So you can just imagine over the course of hundreds upon hundreds of years, the history and the kindred that have been formed between Thor and the dwarves of Nidavellir. But in this moment, while Thor is lowering Eitri into the ground and telling him kind words and telling him like, Eitri, you will be avenged. But then Odin just comes up behind Thor and he tells him that a king cannot rule from his knees, boy. And when Odin says this, Thor gets livid. And he tells Odin that he's gonna do what he pleases. But as for Odin, who Thor addresses as a loyal subject of Asgard, and Thor tells him, you're gonna bite your tongue when you address your king. And Odin's more or less like, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do, cry to your mother again? And when Odin says that, Thor then sends Odin into the air of Nidavellir. And on one hand with this happening, you have Odin who's like, okay, well this is getting old, but I'm gonna give this kid a pass. But for Thor, the fact that Odin is kind of lightly joking and not taking this all the way seriously, that in itself really pisses Thor off. Because it's one thing that the forge at Nidavellir is pretty much a graveyard now, but on top of that, what's happening here, this is all Odin's fault, and it goes back to Donald Blake, to where with him learning the truth about his creation drove him to madness, and as a result, people died. Odin's enchantment on Mjolnir, that wore off, and aside from the slaughter at Nidavellir that was done by Mjolnir, it's been causing all kind of chaos and having Thor looking like he can't handle the seat of King of Asgard. But I will also say that at this point, we know that the undoing of Odin's enchantments, whether it's Donald Blake or whether it's Mjolnir, that all of this was called out a while ago by Angela, back when we saw her tell Thor and Odin. The undoing of Odin's enchantments is the entropy that's growing around them, which we know from the introduction of this event, like the entropy is a step in the larger cycle, which means the undoing of Odin's enchantments, that's the last step before eternity, and we're seeing it overlap with the other part of the cycle that is rage, which they're seeing from this point from just looking around Nidavellir, that the rage part of the cycle, it's already begun to go into annihilation. But keep in mind, the cycle itself is something as the reader that we're kind of given just to keep in the back of our mind. So going through this, it's not like Odin and Thor are following along the cycle and picking up any hints. Like, no, not at all. But even with that, there are some things that Odin's aware of as far as what he's done and what this could potentially mean, but even for him, there's a level of uncertainty. But Thor's going off on Odin because it's his fault that this God of Hammers person is out there with Mjolnir, and more death has been brought because of that. And Thor tells Odin, everything's broken, everything you touch, everything you ever made is falling apart. And I'd even make an argument at this point that Thor even feels that way about himself, because for the greater part of this whole series, he's been trying to hold it together. But then in the middle of this, they're then whisked away to Jotunheim by Loki, only to find out that there is more destruction that has been caused by Mjolnir. And when Loki brings them here, he fills them in about Mjolnir not only causing destruction in his kingdom, but also across the 10 realms. And so for us as the reader, we're given like a glimpse of the destruction that had taken place across the different realms, like Alfheim, Svartalfheim with the Dark Elves, where others were just slaughtered, and we were also given a glimpse to some realms like Heaven, to where them and a couple others actually held it down, and it was more of a battle than people just getting wiped out. But with Thor and Odin coming to Jotunheim, Loki brings up what Thor had mentioned before, with him saying let there be peace, so let there be thunder. And with the condition that everything's gotten to now, Loki's like, where's your peace? Where's your thunder? And Thor finishes that statement with asking, where's Mjolnir? Because Thor knows that Loki's been aware of his situation for some time now. Because like we'd seen prior to this, Loki knew that there was trouble in paradise. He heard when Thor got knocked out by his own hammer, and he went to go check on Thor. Thor's like, don't tell nobody about this. But towards the end of that conversation, Thor's leaving. Loki's like, where are you going? And at the time, Thor said, I'm going to end this. To where then we saw Thor head to Captain America and then leave Mjolnir at Avengers Mountain. And even when Thor discovered that Mjolnir was stolen before he went to Sif, he went to Loki, asking for his help to find Mjolnir. And at that time, Loki initially said no, because he has his kingdom to focus on. But fast forward to now with this God of Hammers situation, bringing annihilation to Loki's doorstep, and you can tell with Loki that there's been a shift to where now he realizes that this is everyone's problem. But then it's here where Thor then asks, who is he? Who is the God of Hammers? And Odin just cuts in because he thinks this whole thing is ridiculous. Because in Odin's perspective, the God of Hammers is like a myth or the boogeyman. But then Loki makes a very valid point, because everyone at this table is pretty much a myth, at least to the people of Midgard. And from there, Odin goes on to say why he believes it's a myth, because if he was such a god, and Thor just shuts that down like, look, nobody asked you. But then it's here where Loki lets them know that regardless of what either of them think, the 10 realms believe that this was an attack that came from Asgard, because at the end of the day, this was Thor's hammer. And it's a possibility, like Heaven for example, they may even know that this wasn't Thor's fault, but like Angela said, if the issues of Asgard keep causing problems for everywhere else, then she's coming for the throne. But nonetheless, Loki lets them know that the 10 realms, they're ready for war and they're prepared to make their attack on Asgard. And so far, Loki's been able to hold them back, but that's not something that's gonna last. And it's here where Loki tells the two of them that he doesn't know the details of what's going on between them and their disagreement of whether the God of Hammers is a prophecy or a myth, but Loki lets them know that it's real. And even though Loki hasn't gathered his information from the Tome of Kings like Thor and Odin, but in his case, he searched the universe to find what he could, only to then discover that a lot of this information had been destroyed recently. But for Loki, much of what he did find, it all said the same thing. The God of Hammers will rise, he will ignite the 10 realms, and he will take the last king of Asgard, and then there will be nothing. Nothing but distant sound of a forge burning, raging, as the God of Hammers reshapes the world. And with hearing this, Odin's putting everything together. with the 10 realms being up in arms, as well as these legends that Loki's found, and Odin figures we're gonna have another war of realms. But then Loki tells him, and Thor picks it up pretty quickly, but Loki tells him like it doesn't mean ignite the realms as far as starting a war, but it means ignite the realms literally. But then it's here where Odin tries to tell Thor something, but he doesn't get to say it because immediately the Bifrost opens and it's Sif and Throg who just show up and they're telling Thor, you have to come with us now. So Thor leaves and he never gets to hear what Odin was about to say. But regardless of whatever it was that Odin was gonna say, I kinda got a feeling that Thor is gonna get that message pretty soon. But with Sif taking Thor from Jotunheim, it takes Thor a moment to realize where he is, but not long after he sees that he's arrived in Midgard on Earth and he's in Broxton, Ohio. And as far as he can see, there's nothing but destruction, which for Thor, like, this is another hard hit, much like we talked about with his relationship with the dwarves at Nidavellir, because after Ragnarok, when Asgard was reestablished on Earth, it was right here in Broxton, Oklahoma. And even though at the time there was a bit of back and forth about the people of Broxton and how they felt about Asgardians just moving in, but nonetheless, these were Thor's neighbors. There was a history in Broxton, and with him arriving here and seeing them slaughtered too, it hits different. And so with Thor seeing this, he calls for Mjolnir. And when he does, it's pretty epic. But when Thor does this and Mjolnir comes racing down from the sky, he sees this and then for a moment he's kind of like, finally. But then like at the last second he notices that Mjolnir ain't got no brakes, because Mjolnir just comes crashing down on Thor to only then start striking him from each and every direction, which right away just causes Thor to think that whoever's attacking him is either invisible or they're hiding from revealing their identity. So then he calls them out as a coward and he tells them to stop hiding, tell me your name. For him then to hear a voice that says, oh Thor, you know my name. You have always known it. I am the god of hammers. I am Mjolnir. And it's here where we see the Tempest Storm outside of the hammer. And we find that the Tempest Storm, she's the god of hammers. But at this point for Thor, he still doesn't understand what's going on. And as far as the Tempest, who's just referring to herself as Mjolnir, she just lays into Thor without much of any explanation at this point. But with her throwing the hammer into Thor and knocking him into a lake, or what's left of a lake, in what seems to be an attempt to drown him, with the hammer pushing him deeper and deeper into the water. But with this happening, Thor just calls for lightning and he burns out all the water in the lake, to where then Mjolnir is like, clever. But then from here where Thor starts to ask, who are you? What kind of trick is this? How are you doing this? And it's here where she begins to fill Thor in on a bit of their history. Because as far as Thor being aware of the history of the Tempest Storm, I really don't think he knew. Because even if we look back to the different tellings of the origin of Thor, or better yet his initial introduction to Mjolnir, this would be presented in a way to where he was either a child and he would just admire Mjolnir and Asgard, to where in that case Mjolnir was just there. But even at times when we had seen Thor being introduced to Mjolnir at an older age, we'd see him arriving at the forge at Nidavellir, but at a point in time where most of the work was done, with Thor only being aware that the forging of Mjolnir was a gift to Odin, because Odin had previously saved the dwarves from the troll invasion, to where after that Odin enchanted Mjolnir, but to Thor's knowledge, even in this case, that's all Thor knew. And it wasn't like there was a point where Odin had just sat Thor to the side and he was just like, hey, look here son, there's an ancient Tempest Storm inside of that hammer, so you know what I'm saying, my magic wear off, we in trouble. No, because Odin's always been about results, and he's always justified his actions by the outcomes. And at this point in the bigger picture with the cycle that's going with everything, the rage leading into annihilation has already begun with the god of hammers, to where then also the rage, it's got a little bit more to go, we gonna get there. But everything that's happening, we're seeing it all follow that larger cycle, and from here it's only getting worse. But it's here where the god of hammers, she tells Thor, you wounded me. You and I have been together for so long, except for that brief dalliance with Jane, and she tells Thor like, I hope you didn't get jealous. And right there I can just picture Thor being like, scoff. But she tells Thor like, you of all people should know about sowing one's wild oats. And from there she's like, more or less just call it a phase. And I'll tell you right now, there's a word for that type of phase, and we just gonna move along, we not gonna go there. But at this time, with Thor still not fully aware of what's going on, he tells her, you know nothing about me, but get this hammer off of me and you gonna learn. And with Thor saying that, I'll just say right now, you can't threaten nobody that you gonna kick their butt, but before you kick their butt, you need their help so that you can kick their butt. And I mean, I'm not a threats expert, but I just don't think it works like that. But then from here, she removes the hammer and Thor's like, he couldn't breathe. Which again is not the best sound that should be coming out of your mouth after threatening somebody. Like, they're gonna be like, oh, you wheezy, huh? But with doing this, the god of hammers is like, sure, we can fight if it'll spare me another one of those speeches. And she lets Thor know that that's all it comes down to. The speeches, titles, crowns, thrones, parliaments, and senate meetings, blah blah blah. And she has grown tired of it. And when she lets him up, it's here where Thor calls for lightning, to where then he forms it into a sword, which is something we don't see Thor do that often, which likely is because most of the time in the past he's had Mjolnir, to where then you can tell that Mjolnir doesn't really have the most experience of seeing Thor fight without Mjolnir, aside from a few exceptions. But through the course of the fight at this point, Mjolnir starts moving super fast, and she tells Thor, the god of thunder, that no one can outrun the lightning. And when she says this and Thor kind of catches her position, he goes to swing, but then she puts up Mjolnir, and the impact just shatters the bones in Thor's forearm. Like they broke out of his arm. Like he looking at his bones looking back at him. And as Thor's looking at this in disbelief, the god of hammers tells him that I know more than anyone how this must feel. I have been there at your side, in your hand, every single time you have beaten back another gathering storm of death. I have watched for eons. I know of all your deeds and those that you have forgotten. All the times of your triumphs, your secrets, your weaknesses, and yes, Thor, you can be broken. You just have to learn how. But just before the god of hammers can land the striking blow, Odin steps in, saying let's end this, and the god of hammers thinks that Odin is talking to her, like he's come out here to die in place of his son. But Odin tells her, I'm not talking to you. And right then, Sif opens the Bifrost, sending the god of hammers to a location that's just called the farthest place from here. And so now I'm not familiar with this location, and clearly neither is the god of hammers, because when she gets there and she looks around, like it's looking like Dark Knight's metal out here. Like I don't know what's going on. Like I wouldn't have been surprised if Barbados was just like, ooh, look, a hammer. But with doing this, Odin essentially had Sif send the god of hammers beyond the furthest point of known existence. And I'll tell you right now, if there was any chance of us getting a secret crisis, it would have had to do something with this place at some point in time. But with sending the god of hammers here, Thor tells Odin that he fought this thing and that it called itself Mjolnir, and Mjolnir had been brought to life somehow. And it's here where Odin tells Thor the true history of Mjolnir and how he trapped the Mother Storm into that piece of Uru eons ago, and how the dwarves had told him that when they forged that cursed rock into Mjolnir, those that died making it, their voices and their souls, they live on in the hammer itself. But at that time, Odin didn't think much of it. And from here, Odin's kind of telling Thor not to even worry about it, because that hammer at this point, it's on its way back, as they look up and see Mjolnir coming in full speed right back in at him, which Odin had believed shouldn't be possible. But with the hammer heading straight for Thor, Odin pushes Thor out the way, and Odin takes that hit right in the back. And it's bad, like it's really bad, because the god of hammers, she literally blew his back out. Like I don't know no other way to say it, because that's literally what happened. And with Odin laying here just saying my legs, he's unable to walk, and you can tell that he's just completely out of the fight. And it's here where the god of hammers tells Thor, it hurts, doesn't it? To lose, to be left alone. And with her saying this, Thor asks her why. Why are you doing this? Because at this point, we've seen that Odin's filled in Thor on the details. But even with Thor knowing who the god of hammers is in a practical sense, he still really doesn't know Mjolnir. And it's here where she tells him, you've taken me for granted, you always have, but none of you have ever understood me. And the god of hammers breaks it down, starting with the enchantment, with Thor thinking that the enchantment called for a worthy warrior, someone noble or true of heart. And when she asks Thor, does any of that describe you? Thor don't say nothing, because he know like, nope, that ain't me. And she tells him, I am a hammer. To be worthy of me is to break, smash, to destroy. And as far as Thor lately with the throne, the crown, the speeches, this isn't the first time that Mjolnir has grown tired of all this. And when she says that, Thor knows that's why Mjolnir went to Jane. And really prior to this, some hammer counseling could have solved this problem, but right now we're past that point. Because when Mjolnir tells Thor, yes, Jane threw me into the sun and you left me broken, you left me to burn. But you see, I wasn't alone in the sun. There was something else there, something powerful, and we burned together. And then we were remade as one. Its spirit became entangled with mine, its soul inside of me. And Thor just says no, because he already knows who it is. And I mean, we know too, and not only just from this huge cycle that's been going, because we saw when Mjolnir went to the sun and who went along for the ride. And now that we know that Mjolnir's had entanglements with this person, you can tell it's just some trouble around the corner. And when she says, I awoke with a voice, with the rage of a billion beings, with the rage of the Mangog. And right there, we find that Mjolnir's rage this whole time has been on a whole nother level. And with Thor looking at this, he is looking at the embodiment of this universal rage that is ready to take it to the next step, which is annihilation. Alright, so with Thor just coming to the realization that the god of hammers is Mjolnir, to only then have the bomb dropped on him that Mjolnir is merged with the Mangog, which on one hand explains why Mjolnir has been moving on this path of annihilation with the rage of a billion beings. But also while they're here in Broxton, Oklahoma, in the wake of the devastation caused by Mjolnir. Thor's arm is broken, Odin's back is just completely gone at this point, with that hit from Mjolnir just shattering his back at full speed. But at this point where it seems like all hope is lost for Thor, we then go to Beta Ray Bill, who's gathering up warriors and heroes to make their way to Oklahoma to fight at Thor's side. And this recruitment that he does is pretty cool, because more or less he's like, my weak people stand to the left, my real fighters get to the right. And he rounds up warriors from Asgard, as well as the Fantastic Four, Ben Reilly Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, Captain America, Iron Man, Throg, Lockjaw, Lockheed, Wolverine. But he lets everyone here know that one way or another, this is gonna end in blood. But with Thor at this point snapping his arm back into place, with him talking to Mjolnir, he believes that she's been possessed by Mangog. And with Mjolnir returning here, he can at least help her with finding a way to separate Mangog from her, with again, Thor believing that she's being possessed. But Mjolnir clears it up for Thor pretty quickly, with letting Thor know that she's not possessed, but rather that the Mangog had opened her eyes, which like we knew prior to now, that this isn't a case of just Mjolnir being taken over by the Mangog, but instead these are two entities who have been wronged by Odin, who have now been remade as one. And with the way that Mjolnir goes to describe this further, she just tells Thor that she's been given a voice. And with her saying that, it just tells Thor that she meant to do what she did, as far as the annihilation in Nidavellir in Oklahoma, as well as the rest of the devastation and destruction that she's caused across the 10 realms. And when this happens, it's here where Beta Ray Bill and the other heroes, as well as the other warriors, make their way to the fight. And when they show up, Thor just cries out to these guys like, no, like, y'all not ready. And with Thor saying this, really is because he doesn't want them there, because he knows that the god of hammers will just see them there as another opportunity for her to kill more people who are close to Thor. So when they show up here and they're trying, like they're really trying, but they're not doing damage. But then it's here where Thor gets on his knees and he prays to his mother, with him saying, "Mother, I need you. Please hear me. Grant me your gifts. Give me your power, so that I may protect those in need, so that I may save my father." And it's right there where Thor gets an answer from his mother. And he's like, ah, there you are. And when this happens, it's also us getting the confirmation of who Thor's actual mother is. Because when Thor gets his answer from his mother, it's not a bird that's on fire, but instead is an energy tornado, which is pretty much Donny Cates confirming that Thor's mother is still Gia, and otherwise putting a reverse Uno card on Jason Aaron. And when this happens, the heroes are initially like, okay, what? And Reed Richards points out that this energy tornado, it's pretty much impenetrable. And it's here where Freya lets them know that this is Thor creating a barrier to protect them. And with how she says this, you can tell that Freya also understands that this is Gia stepping in for her son. But also with this happening, I want to point out that this whole God of Hammers event, in a way it kind of reminds me of Spider-Man Homecoming, when Tony told Peter, if you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it. And to me, in moments like this, it's very much like Thor being tested the same way, with him not having Mjolnir. And this time, it's very different than other times where we've seen Thor without Mjolnir, because we've seen that song and dance a few times. But now with God of Hammers, it's really cranking up the things that define Thor that are not Mjolnir. Because to most people, when you say Thor, they're expecting Mjolnir, almost like when you say hamburger, like you expecting buns. So for this event, that's pretty much Thor versus Mjolnir and Mangog, as well as the aftermath with Donald Blake and Devourer King and him newly becoming king, and Thor having to deal with most of this without the hammer. And it's really us seeing him step out of a place of comfort and out of a space where he was confident and somehow find a solution by just being Thor, which at this point kicked in nicely that he's the son of Gia, and it causes Thor to lean more into who he is rather than just picking up another hammer or just him running back to Yarnborn. But then it's here where Thor asks Mjolnir, like, why have you killed so many in my name? And it's here where she tells Thor that the Mangog had opened her eyes, because with the Mangog being another one of Odin's sins, with the Mangog being the hatred of a billion beings that Odin had slaughtered for whatever reason when they're in the sun, the Mangog taught Mjolnir that the gods deserve a reckoning for the games that they play. And it's here where Mjolnir says this, that she lets Thor know that her and Mangog sent the serpent to Donald Blake, which is what caused Donald Blake to discover the truth about himself and the sandbox that he was living in. To where then, after Donald Blake had learned the truth and then killed the serpent, which from Mjolnir is pretty much a confession of her and Mangog starting the whole prey event. But with her saying this, it's here where Thor encases the god of hammers within a huge pillar of rocks and vines, and as soon as he does, he then hears his father Odin calling for him. And even when Thor rushes to Odin, you can still hear in the background like the god of hammers breaking through that pillar, like it's not gonna hold for long. But then it's here with Thor rushing to Odin, to where initially he tells his father, I gotta get you somewhere to get you some help, I can carry you. But then Odin lets Thor know that he's not going anywhere. And with Odin saying this, he's like, Mjolnir was right. And Odin tells Thor that all of his creations have come undone. Everything except you, except for Thor. And he tells Thor, you are the greatest thing that I've ever made. And when Odin says that, man, those mighty tears get to falling. And it's really a big moment because Odin doesn't talk to Thor like this, bro. Like, he doesn't. But then it's here with Odin telling Thor that there was so much more that he still wanted to do. He wanted to see Thor's mother again, and he wanted to be strong, which is the reason why he held back from giving Thor the entirety of the Odin Force. But when he says this to Thor, he really doesn't spell it out all the way. But even still, it kind of feels like Thor more or less knows what Odin is getting at, and you can tell by the fear in Thor's eye. And it's here where Odin tells Thor, the Odin Force, boy, it cannot be given in full until I am gone. And it's here where Odin gives Thor the rest of the Odin Force in its entirety. And with the way that this happens, with Thor just screaming, Father, no, don't, it very much looks like that moment when the Odin Force was born, when Odin's brothers, Vili and Ve, gave up their life force and passed it to Odin, creating the Odin Force. In the moment when they were facing Surtur, and the two of them sacrificed themselves rather than fleeing and allowing Surtur to leave Muspelheim. And in this moment for Odin, he's doing the same for his son, and it really feels like Thor issue 349. With Odin passing the entirety of the Boar son birthright, the entirety of the Odin Force, to his son Thor, the king of Asgard. And it's a really emotional moment because like I'm not a father, but I've been a son my entire life. So for us to see a lot of those fresh moments of the arguments between Thor and Odin, to where you get those moments where the anger or the frustration is expressed, but then on the flip side, we get multiple moments where Odin proves again and again, in spite of his flaws, he loves his son. Because it wasn't too long ago that he took Mjolnir to the back for his son, like, come on. And then to see him here, pass the Odin Force to Thor in its entirety, it just has me like, man, like I would love to see this story amongst a number of others with just full Odin commentary. But then also when this happens, the god of hammers breaks out from that pillar, but with doing so, only then to behold the Golden King of Asgard. Which again, for me at least, this story is really hitting the nail on the head as far as fulfilling Thor in his position, without the need of Mjolnir defining him. And like I said, we've seen the concept done in other ways before, but this time here with both Gia and Odin blessing the Golden Child, who's in this moment facing who I would say are two of Thor's biggest oppositions, being his own hammer and Mangog. But then it's here where Thor then tells Sif to send him her sword, Hofund. And with doing this, he lets her know that he's gonna give it back, but you know, the king's gotta do some stuff. But it's here for Thor, with using Hofund, he summons the Bifrost, and he binds Mjolnir with it, letting her know that she is a great and dreadful storm. And with saying this, he tells her, but nonetheless, I am still your god. And it's here where Thor sends the two of them to Nidavellir, and initially Mjolnir is like, where are we? And when she says that, I'm just thinking like, man, all these years and she hasn't done a full tour? But with Thor bringing her here to the forge, he cranks the heat up to the heat of 1 billion suns. And when he does, he just walks into it. Like, that's a flex right there, man. Come on. And he tells Mjolnir, this is where you were born and this is where you will die. And when this happens, she quickly tries to strike him with the hammer, but Thor just grabs it, telling Mjolnir that she cannot hurt him, to where then he starts striking the forge repeatedly with the hammer, up to the point to where the hammer is just completely destroyed. And with Thor doing this, like I'm telling you, I can't stress it enough, this story really feels like the definitive answer to who is Thor without the hammer. But with Thor doing this and destroying Mjolnir, we're told in this moment that Mjolnir is the last remnant of Odin's legacy, and with Thor smashing it to pieces, it's the last step of the entropy, which, as we've seen before, the entropy part of the huge cycle, it was the work and the enchantments of Odin's creations being undone. So with Thor destroying the hammer, he's completing the entropy portion of that cycle, to where, like we've seen before, one part of the cycle, it affects the other, and in this moment, all the pieces were present: fire, rage, eternity, entropy, and most definitely annihilation. But for Thor, with him exerting this much power, he exhausts the Odin Force, which at this point I guess you could say is the Thor Force in its fullness, which is now taking Thor into a Thor sleep, or the All Sleep as Sif would say, which is the same as your Odin sleep or your Odin rest. But for Thor, with him falling into the sleep, when he wakes up, 4 months have passed, which for Odin was one of those things to where the amount of time that he needed for the Odin rest, it would be determined by how fast Odin drained the Odin Force. But in this case with the 4 months, I'm cool with that, because it would suck for Thor to wake up way later when we know that there's things in the future that he still has to take care of. But for Thor, it's here where he wakes up and Angela's there, Freya's there, Loki's there, and Thor lets them know before he had woken up he had heard the voice of Odin. And it's here where Angela tells him that since Thor's been asleep, they haven't had a ceremony for Odin, partially because there really wasn't a body left after what happened, but then also because when they do have that ceremony, it would only be right to have it when Thor's there. But with everyone trying to help Thor up out of his sleep and give him things that he needs, and it's here where Angela's just like, okay, bump all that, I know what he needs, to where from there she tells Thor to finish getting dressed and meet her in the armory. And with Thor hearing this, he's kind of like, the armory. But when they go there, it's here where Angela shows Thor that within that time of the past 4 months, all the angels of heaven, they came together and reassembled Thor's hammer. And with us seeing this, it's a really big moment, especially with what we'd seen before with Angela expressing that if Thor didn't clean up his mess, that she would, which before meant her taking the throne if he didn't figure this whole thing out. But since he did work things out and the destruction of his hammer was the only quote unquote mess that he'd left behind, Angela stayed true to her word and she cleaned up by getting the angels to reassemble Thor's hammer, which really just reaffirms that Angela never really wanted to take the throne from Thor. But also back at the time when she saw that things were getting out of hand and she summoned both Thor and Odin, she knew that the solution had to do with Thor and Odin working together. But in the middle of this conversation, Angela, she just leaves straight up Batman style, like don't say nothing. But while Thor's here, he then gets on his knees and he prays to his father. Because in this moment, he's even hesitating to pick up the hammer. And for that reason, he drops to his knees and he prays to his father because Thor's just uncertain about the path that he should take. And it's here where Thor hears a voice saying, "Keep your eyes open, boy. A king can't rule," from his knees. And with hearing this, Thor looks up at the hammer and he's like, "Father?" And at this point, I don't know if Odin's in the hammer or he's speaking through the hammer, but I'm pretty sure we'll get those answers towards the end of this month once we get Thor issue 750, which is also the 60th anniversary of Thor, to where in that issue we'll get Odin's funeral as well as a ton of new stories from Donny Cates, J. Michael Straczynski, Walt Simonson, Al Ewing, and a ton of others. So who knows what we'll learn from there. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.